Now, I've seen a lot of arguments going around online that Lando bottled the championship in the fastest car, or that Charles bottled the championship in 2022 in not necessarily the fastest car, but what was a championship lead. So I'm here to dissect who actually bottled the championship. Now, before we continue, I feel the need to get my biases out into the air. I am a Charles Leclerc and Ferrari girl. Through and through, they are my number ones, and McLaren and Lando Norris are probably at a net zero for me in terms of how I rank them. Just personally, that's not based on skill or anything, that's just personal feelings. So in order to eradicate this bias, I have been in discussion with a lot of McLaren girls just to really figure out a lot of things that were going on with Lando during the season, so I feel like I can have a more nuanced conversation about this. So let's move on to the video. I will start by saying my short answer to this question is that neither of them bottled the championship. I don't really think either of them really stood a chance given in the entirety of the season, but let's actually get into why. In the beginning of 2022, we saw Charles Leclerc leading the championship. He won 2 out of the first 3 races, even picking up a Grand Slam in Australia. And in those same 3 races, we saw Max Verstappen DNF in 2 of them. And in the 1 race that he did finish, he won. So while in the beginning, it really seemed that Ferrari and Red Bull had very similar pace cars, Red Bull was struggling a lot more with their reliability. Charles' season took a turn for the worse in Imola, where he should have finished P3, but after spinning out during the race, only finished P6. And then in Miami, we got our first glimpses of the Ferrari just really not having as much pace, especially in the straights, compared to the Red Bull. And the race after Miami, we'd see one of Ferrari's greatest issues come into play, and that was their reliability. In Spain, Charles was leading the race. It looked like it was going to be another Grand Slam for him. He had pole, he was leading by a clear 20-30 seconds before the pit stops, but his power unit failed him, so he ended up retiring from the race. And only the next race we would see Ferrari's next biggest issue, which was their strategy. In Monaco, Charles was starting on pole and looked very much set to win this race. He had pretty clear lead ahead of everybody else, but it was changeable conditions. So everyone is coming into pit now for slicks. The track is drying up. We hear Charles' radio message, box, box, he's coming in.
And box now, box now, box for hard.
The minute we see him enter the pit lane, all we hear is, stay out, stay out.
Stay out, stay out, stay out.
What happens is, Carlos is already coming into pit. Ferrari is not set up for this double stack properly, so now Charles is waiting behind Carlos to finish his pit before he could come in to now change his tires as well. So not only does Charles lose the place to his teammate, but he loses the place to Checo and Max. He finishes the race P4 when this was a pretty clear win for him.
Tire position 5.
Baku again, we would see him start on pole and be pretty comfortable in the lead. Engine failure. Again, he doesn't finish the race. So now at this point in the season, Max and Charles are both suffering with the same amount of DNF, so reliability is pretty much evened out now. In Canada, because of Baku, we would see Charles start from P20 because he had to replace his engine. He was able to work it up to a P5, but if he started P20 and ended up P5, imagine where he could have been without the engine penalty. Silverstone was another race where we saw really big issues with Ferrari's strategy team, summed up in Ferrari have won but with the wrong driver. In Silverstone, Charles started behind his teammate, but very comfortably took the lead and was looking set to win this race. But a late safety car meant that everyone was coming in for new tires. But Ferrari, being Ferrari, they decide this is a really good idea to keep Charles out for track position. We are going to keep him on his old hard tires. We are going to pit Carlos, who is behind him, for new softs. And the 2 other cars behind him are also going to pit for new softs. Okay. Charles is defending for a little bit, but very easily loses his lead to Sainz. And then we see Checo and Lewis behind him, also on new softs, very much catching up to Charles. Charles is defending, but there is not much he can do at this point. So now, instead of winning the race, which he was pretty much set to do, he again finishes P4.
Here we go, DRS open down towards the left-hander of Brooklyn. He's going to try and go around the outside, but no, Leclerc still blocks the view and he goes wide. And now he's got a chance to go all the way around the outside of left field. The crowd are going crazy. He's done it. He's up into 3rd place.
The battle's not over yet, though.
No, he's not. You're right. Leclerc's going to try and come back at him, but he's got the inside line down towards Klopp's corner. This should be a good position.
It's right around the outside of Klopp's.
My goodness, where's Hamilton now? Is he still on the inside? No, he's got it back.
Austria saw victory again for Charles, but this would be the last one of the season, as in the next race in France, where he also looked set to either win or finish P2, he crashed out. This was entirely Charles. Like, this was not a Ferrari reliability issue. He quite literally spun out and hit the wall. I have no excuses for him there.
No!
And at this point in the season, we really saw development fall away from Ferrari and really go into Red Bull's hands. Ferrari was trying to get a car that would work a little bit better for Carlos, who doesn't really have the same driving style as Charles, but then also there was the flexi floor issue with that kind of being a toss-up on whether that was the thing. People say it didn't affect Ferrari that much, but who really knows? And then Red Bull was building their rocket ship that we would also see again in 2023. And after Austria, Max would go on to win 9 of the next 11 races. In Hungary, we saw another strategy issue for Ferrari, and what looked like was going to be a win for Charles, if not somewhere pretty high in the podium. He finished P6 because Ferrari decided to put him on hard tires, even though it was like very much clear that entire weekend that the hard tires were not the correct tire, but I digress. In Japan again, Charles didn't have the best of races and he dropped from a P2 to a P3. And Ferrari's last big strategy mistake this season would come during Brazil, when in a wet quali it was slightly dry track for Q3. We see everyone lining up outside the pits. Everyone's like, yeah, we're getting ready to go set our lap times. Charles is in the front. We hear him come over the radio saying, am I the only one on intermediates? He was. Every single other car behind him is on slick tires and Charles Leclerc is on intermediates. So it's starting to rain a little bit, but the slicks are still the clear fastest tire. So everybody sets a lap time on the slick tires and Charles does not get that opportunity. So essentially destroying his qualifying. And then Lando hit him during the race and he spun out. He was able to get back in, but he recovered to a P4. So this race wasn't the worst that it could have been, but so many things went wrong this weekend. In the end, Charles would finish the season P2 right in front of Checo. So in the end, going through the total amount of points lost due to both Ferrari and Charles, we can total up to 123 points. Breaking that down, Charles lost 25 points for himself in France, 3 points in Japan, and 7 points in Imola, totaling to 35 points. Now, on the other hand, looking at the Ferrari reliability and issues that they had, 25 points in Spain, 18 points in Baku, 17 points in Hungary, 13 points in Monaco, 13 points in Silverstone, 2 points in Spa. That's 88 points total. So who was really the bigger one at hand and who had the issues for Ferrari that year? And to put that into perspective, 123 points, if added on to Charles' total that year, is still not enough to catch him up to Max that season. Max won more races in 2022 than he did in 2024. Red Bull was very clearly the fastest car this season, and yes, in the beginning it did seem like a toss-up, and yes, Charles Leclerc did lose a championship lead, but I don't think it was ever going to go that way with the way Ferrari development went and the way their strategy and reliability were. There was no chance of Charles winning this championship. Now let's take a look into Lando's 2024 season. What I think a lot of people seem to forget about the 2024 season is that out of the first 7 races, Max Verstappen won 5 of them, and for the first 2, he won by 20 plus seconds. It very much looked like we had another 2023 on our hands, but after everything that happened this season, this part kind of just gets thrown under the rug. McLaren also at the beginning of the season did not have the first or second fastest car. That was, again, Red Bull and Ferrari. McLaren had at most the 3rd fastest car, and it wasn't until Miami that we really saw this flipped script for them with their upgrades. By the midpoint of the season with the McLaren upgrades, it very much looked like we had a championship battle on our hands and everyone was convinced that there was going to be a battle. And it wasn't until after Brazil that all that noise kind of quieted down and everyone was like, well, there was really no hope anyway that he was ever going to win the title, which I don't know if I necessarily believe that, because if Brazil had gone the way it looked, with Max starting P17 and Lando starting P1, and if it ended up finishing that way with Max out of the points and Lando finishing first, a 25-point swing would have meant they were super close in points, and I don't think the narrative that Lando never had a chance would have been thrown around, because he very much did still have a chance until that point. Yes, it was still pretty big before Brazil, but if Brazil had gone the way that it looked, this conversation would have never had started. But looking through the season, it is really mixed to say how much this championship battle was ever on. Not really because McLaren was suffering from reliability issues. That was the least of their worries. They actually did not have reliability issues at all, but their strategy team and just the drivers themselves never really looked set for a championship. So while McLaren and Lando didn't have the big reliability or crash issues of Ferrari in 2022, it was a way more competitive season, which meant having a bad start to the race dropped you 2 to 3 places, and these cars aren't really easy to overtake, and McLaren really suffered in dirty air, so oftentimes dropping those 2 to 3 places ruined their entire race. It was more than just Max getting the jump on Lando. Like at the start of the race though, it was a multitude of drivers that really got the jump on Lando at the beginning of the race. We saw George, we saw Charles, we saw his teammate, we saw Max, we saw nearly every single team be able to get the jump on Lando at the start. In China's sprint, we saw him drop from 1st to 6th in the sprint, losing him 4 points because it was really set that Max was going to win that race anyway, but like he should have finished P2 in that sprint and not P6. In Spain, again, starting on pole, lost the lead to George and Max at that point because George had a great start that race. Like that was one of the most beautiful starts I've ever seen. But he was never able to get past Max again, so he ended up finishing P2 when he should have easily won that race. Austria is a tricky situation because I feel like it's a little bit on both drivers' ends, because after the crash, Lando destroyed the bottom of his car and was unable to restart the race. Meanwhile, Max was able to just pit for new tires and finish the race in the points. But I would say this was an issue of aggressive driving on both ends. Max Verstappen knowing how to cross the line, but knowing how it won't affect him and it won't cause a penalty for him, which is one of his greatest skills. And Lando kind of being a newbie to battling Max. In Hungary, he lost the lead to his teammate, but that race was a mess of McLaren strategy. Oscar was in the lead, they undercut him with Lando, and now Lando is very clearly in the lead 3 seconds on his teammate, and they're telling Lando that he has to switch with Oscar when Lando is pretty much clearly leading this race. It's not like they are tail to tail with each other. Now there's a big gap between them, and now Lando has to slow down a lot to let Oscar through, but then it was going to be a bigger issue if he didn't because it's really messing up McLaren's strategy. Hungary is just, even as a non-McLaren fan, like I was hurting for them because like that was just atrocious to watch. In Spa, another race of lost points for Lando. He was starting 4th, ended up 5th, and Oscar finished that race P2. In Monza on lap 1, we saw him not only lose places to his teammate, but also to Charles, meaning by starting on pole, he ends up P3 by the end of lap 1. He's not holding on to his tires as well as Oscar, but then again, Oscar's also running in clean air, which we know is very much key for the McLaren team. They're able to undercut Charles at the first round of pit stops, but McLaren are set on this 2-strap strategy. His tires are degrading faster than both Oscar's and Charles. They pit him again. They end up pitting Oscar again, even though that probably wasn't their smartest of ideas. Ferrari stays on the 1-stop strategy. Charles win the race. McLaren P2, P3, when it was easily either a P1, P3 or a P1, P2 for McLaren. In the Austin sprint, we saw a really good start from Lando, but he ended up losing P2 to Carlos in the race, so only finishing P3. In the race for Austin, we saw him battling with Max in turn 1, which led Charles to come through and take the lead of the race, and also Carlos to come through and be ahead of both of them. And then during the race, he was battling with Max the whole time, and let me tell you, as a person who was there, who was sitting at turn 1, turn 2, having to watch those multiple laps where Lando was unable to get past Max Verstappen was quite frustrating because he was trying the same moves over and over and over again and it was not working. And then yes, you can argue that Lando didn't deserve the penalty, but like you did overtake outside the track, and that is Max exploiting the fact that he knows these rules really well. But that is what battling Max Verstappen is all about at the end of the day. Like he knows how to exploit those things, and so to race with him, like you have to get better at that. You have to adapt to that. And yeah, Lando's inexperienced with racing against Max, whole mess of issues. Anyways, he ends up gaining that 5-second penalty, so he ends up finishing behind Max anyway. In Brazil, he missed out on sprint pole to his teammate Oscar, and he was unable to get past Oscar during the sprint, but McLaren employed team strategies and Oscar let Lando through for the win by the end of the race, which was a whole other issue with the way they waited around. But I can't even get into all the stewarding rules because that is like a whole separate other video. In the race for Brazil, Lando took a brilliant pole. I will give him that. Like he very much outclassified the field for Brazil qualifying for the race. Lost it immediately to George, and then strategy during the race, he came in before the safety car. The Alpines and Max stayed out, meaning they benefited from that red flag and they got to literally get new tires for free. So now they are in the lead, but then another safety car and another restart. Lando lost positions to Oscar and Charles. He ended up getting back ahead of Oscar, but now he's finishing 6th behind the 2 Alpines, Max Verstappen, George Russell, and Charles Leclerc. So now after Brazil, the championship fight is over. Max Verstappen is 1 point away from literally winning the whole thing, and he does that in Vegas by finishing ahead of Lando again. But the McLarens were just not great in Vegas, so I don't really have to get into that whole race. And even though there was no hopes of winning the championship anymore, Qatar was another messy race for Lando, and even though he was in P2, missing those yellow flags destroyed his race. A 10-second stop and go penalty, like he finished P10 and he got the fastest lap. Like, that was great. And I know a lot of people argue about that because Max Verstappen ratted him out over the radio, but you would too. You would too. Lando would have done it. Any other driver would have done it if they thought it would gain them the advantage. And they wouldn't have given him the penalty if he didn't do it at the end of the day. Like, they do have to look into the data. They don't just go around handing out a 10-second stop and go penalty. He did not slow under the yellow flag. So in counterpoint though, Abu Dhabi was a great race from him. Took pole, never lost the lead. Great race from him. The more big talking point was the McLaren versus Ferrari, but as long as one of the McLaren drivers won the race, there was no hope for Ferrari anyway. But getting into all those messed up starts from Lando, I remember someone telling me specifically that McLaren were having like a mechanical issue with their car. So I need to get to the bottom of this because this information is not really easy to find. There's like one blog post from McLaren about it, and I believe it was from Hungary when they talked about it, where they had like an electronic issue with the cars. When they went into second gear, they had a wheel spin. I will read the message that I got to you from a McLaren fan because they know more about this than me. In the China sprint spot in Spain, he had bad starts, with the caveat being that Spain and China have really long turn ones. And Hungary had a clutch issue, and in Zandvoort, people who started positions 1, 3, 5, and 7 all lost places. In Monza, he had a fine start, and Oscar passed him on turn 4, so not actually much to do with the start. In Austin, there was a combo of Max pushing him off / hard place to start on pole. And in Brazil, McLaren had some brake lockup issues. So, clearing the air, there were some issues with the McLaren car when it came to their starts. How much it affected his entire season, because he was, I think, the driver that gained the least amount of places during the season. I mean, most of the time he was starting from pole and losing spots, so that's kind of hard to counterpoint, but there were some issues with the McLaren during the starts. So with all that being said, I don't really think either of them bottled the championship. You can make arguments that they had chances to win the championship, but with the way everything was going, especially with Max Verstappen still taking the most amount of wins during both those seasons, I don't know if anyone else really stood a chance at the end of the day. And I think for 2025 is going to be our best chance, because I think starting out, there's going to be another fastest car that is not Red Bull. So from the beginning, somebody will have a jump, even though we saw that in 2022, but by the third race, it was all over for Ferrari. So hopefully 2025 is better, but I truly don't think either of them bottled the championship. And if you are coming here looking for me to belittle one of them, you are not going to get that. So, but anyways, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to follow me on all my socials and subscribe here if you want more videos like this. I love doing little deep dives. They bring me so much joy. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.